The Death of Lucretia, Rembrandt, 1664. This first painting is about a very old story from ancient Rome. It is a story about a woman named Lucretia. She was a real Roman noblewoman who died after being assaulted by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius. Her death triggered a full political revolution that overthrew the monarchy and founded the Roman Republic. Her story has been told for more than 2,000 years, and many artists have painted her final moments. One of the most famous works is Rembrandt's painting The Death of Lucretia from 1664, which shows her sitting alone holding a rope with deep sadness on her face. When Rembrandt painted his two Lucretia works in the mid-1660s, his life was filled with hardship and loss. His wife Saskia had died many years earlier, in 1642, and 3 of their 4 children had died in infancy. His only surviving child, Titus, was the one who lived into adulthood, but even he died in 1668, only a few years after these paintings. Rembrandt later lived with Hendrik Jostoffels, who became his partner, but she too died in 1663, just 1 year before he painted the first Lucretia. On top of this personal grief, Rembrandt was also dealing with severe money problems. He had been declared bankrupt in 1656, and many of his possessions were sold off. By the time he made these paintings, he was living a quiet, troubled life, working hard to support himself and his family. Many art historians believe this deep sadness and struggle can be felt in his emotional, heavy paintings of Lucretia. This story of Lucretia begins with Rome's last king, a man named Tarquin the Proud. He ruled from 534 to 509 BC. People said he became king in a cruel way. According to legend, he sent men to murder the king before him, Servius Tullius. After the murder, the dead king's body was left lying in the street. When the king's own daughter, Tullia, who was also Tarquin's wife, came riding by, her driver tried to avoid the body, but Tullia ordered him to drive right over it. Her father's blood splashed on her clothes. Because of this terrible event, that street in Rome was later called the Accursed Street. This early act shows how dark the Tarquin family really was. King Tarquin was always afraid that others might overthrow him the same way he had overthrown the previous king. So he surrounded himself with guards and ruled through fear. He punished people without fair trials, took away their land, and even sent people into exile just for disagreeing with him. Many people in Rome hated him, but they were too afraid to fight back. The final spark that set off a rebellion did not come from the king himself, but from his son, Sextus Tarquinius. Tarquin had 3 sons, and his oldest son was named Sextus Tarquinius. While the Roman army was attacking a nearby city, Sextus often held wild parties with his friends. One night, during one of these drinking parties, he and the other young men began to brag about whose wife was the most virtuous. One man at the party, Collatinus, was a cousin of the king. He suggested that instead of arguing, they should ride home and check on their wives in secret, to see what they were really doing. The men were drunk but excited by the idea, so they rode on horseback straight to Rome. They found that most of the wives were spending their time in parties or chatting with friends. But when they reached the home of Collatinus, his wife Lucretia was quietly working with her maidservants. She greeted the unexpected visitors kindly. She was calm, respectful, and modest, and everyone could see her character right away. From that moment, Sextus Tarquinius became obsessed with her. But his thoughts were not pure. He began to plan something terrible. A few days later, Sextus came to Lucretia's home again. She welcomed him politely, thinking he was simply a guest. But late that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Sextus went to her room with a sword in his hand. He woke her and tried to force her to give in to him. When she refused, he threatened to kill her. He told her he'll place her beside a dead slave and claimed she was unfaithful. Lucretia realized she could not fight him without losing her honor and her life, so she was forced to give in. At dawn, broken and shaking, she sent for her husband and her father, and she asked each of them to bring a trusted friend. When they gathered around her, she told them everything. They tried to comfort her, telling her she was innocent. But Lucretia believed she could not live with what had happened. She asked the men to swear they would punish the man who had done this. Then, taking a hidden dagger, she stabbed herself in the heart. This is the moment that Rembrandt's painting captures, the quiet but heartbreaking moment just before she collapses. You can see her holding the rope that steadies her weak body, her eyes full of sadness, and the blood running down her dress. Her death shocked the men around her. They took her body to the Roman Forum, where the people gathered. When everyone heard what Sextus, the king's son, had done, the anger that had been growing for years finally exploded. The people rose up and attacked the king's forces. The army joined the rebels, the king fled, and Sextus was killed. Rome became a republic with 2 consuls instead of a king. This new republic was a very big deal. It was the first time Rome had no king at all. Instead of one person who could take all the power, Rome now had 2 leaders called consuls. They had to share every decision, and each one could stop the other if something seemed wrong. They could only rule for 1 year, so no one could stay in charge for too long. This made it much harder for another cruel ruler to rise again. It was the beginning of a new style of government, where power was limited and shared, and it later inspired many other countries in history to build their own free governments. Ophelia, John Everett Millais, 1852. This is Ophelia, a famous painting by John Everett Millais. It shows the character Ophelia from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Ophelia's world collapses when Prince Hamlet not only breaks off their relationship, but also takes her father's life. Lost, sad, and confused, she wanders into the countryside, picking flowers. While she is walking near a stream, she slips, falls into the water, and drowns. This moment is what John Everett chose to paint. He was only 22 years old when he created this artwork. Even though he was young, he was already known as one of the boldest painters of his time. He wanted everything in the painting to look real. So he spent 5 long summer months sitting beside the Hogsmill River in Surrey, painting every leaf, every plant, and every small movement in the water. He wanted nothing to be imagined or guessed. Everything had to come straight from nature. It wasn't until the winter of 1852 that he went back to his studio to paint Ophelia, completing the work by adding her as the focal point. For this, he used a young artist and poet named Elizabeth Siddal as his model. Siddal posed by lying inside a bathtub filled with water, so her body would look like someone floating in a river. We do not know exactly what Siddal was thinking during those long hours. She had to lie completely still while he painted her hands, her dress, her hair, and her face. He worked very close to her. He studied the way her hair spread in the water, how the fabric of her dress caught the light, and even the tiny eyelashes around her eyes. He wanted everything to be perfect. To keep Siddal from getting cold, Everett placed candles under the bathtub to warm the water. But one day the candles went out without him noticing. Siddal stayed in the cooling water for far too long and became extremely sick afterward. Her father almost sued Everett because she developed severe pneumonia. Many people blamed Everett for not paying attention and for letting her lie in the cold water while he focused on his painting. Years later, historians looked back and saw a connection between the drowning Ophelia and Siddal lying silently in that freezing bath. At the time, Siddal could not have imagined how strongly her own story would become tied to the image of Ophelia. Elizabeth Siddal was around 19 years old when she began working in the art world. She trained at an art school and also worked as a seamstress to support herself. By Victorian standards, she was not considered traditionally beautiful, but she had a striking look: short hair, a thin frame, and long copper-colored hair. This unusual appearance caught the attention of a group of young artists called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Several of these artists hired her as a model, which allowed her to spend more time in studios and around painters. Soon Siddal began making her own art. She studied under the well-known artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was charming and talented. The famous critic John Ruskin also believed in her. He even bought everything she created so she could focus fully on her art. But being a woman artist at that time was extremely difficult. Women did not have access to the same resources that male artists had. For example, they often could not hire models, so Siddle painted herself again and again. Society also looked down on women who posed as artist models. In books, newspapers, and drawings, they were often shown as fallen women, doomed to sad or tragic lives. Many of these stories ended with the woman drowning in a dirty river, which reminded Everett of Ophelia's death in Hamlet. Everett did not want Ophelia to seem guilty or impure, the way people judged women in those days. Instead, he painted her in a clean, peaceful country stream. Her dress, which hints at her lost relationship, looks heavy and strange among the bright flowers and flowing water. Her hair is loose and free, moving gently with the current. To Everett, nature was honest. Nature was where life and death connected in a pure, truthful way. 8 years after the painting was finished, Siddall married Rossetti. Many believe she waited so long because getting married meant losing her independence. At that time, wives could not keep their own money. They also faced huge health risks with pregnancy and childbirth, since medicine was not advanced. Siddall suffered a miscarriage, which deeply affected her body and her mind. She never recovered from the depression that engulfed her following her baby's death. Their marriage suffered, and she became convinced Rossetti was, once again, being unfaithful, although his friends claimed he was faithful to her during their marriage. On the evening of 10th of February 1862, the Rossettis went out to dinner with the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne. After they returned home, Rossetti went to teach a night class at the Working Men's College. Before he left, he saw Siddall settled into bed. She had taken her usual dose of laudanum, and there was about half a bottle left. When he returned from work, the bottle was empty. Lizzie was in a sleep so deep he was unable to wake her, and she had written him a note. Despite the efforts of 4 doctors, she died in the early hours of 11th of February 1862. On the advice of their friend, Ford Maddox Brown, Rossetti burnt her final note. This was to ensure she was not declared a suicide and so denied a Christian burial. At the time of her death, Lizzie was pregnant again. Perhaps she feared her baby had stopped moving and could not bear to go through a second stillbirth. After her death, Rossetti was heartbroken. He began another painting, and it shows a woman in a dreamlike state, with her head slightly lifted and her eyes closed. Rossetti used Siddall's face for the figure by painting her as Beatrice, a pure and holy figure from Dante's poetry. He tried to escape the reality of what had happened, and instead remember her as an angelic, almost untouchable soul. This painting also links back to Millais's Ophelia in a powerful way. Just as Siddall had posed silently in cold water while Everett painted the moment of Ophelia's drowning, Rossetti later painted her again as a woman on the edge of death. In both images, Siddall becomes frozen in time as someone fragile, passive, and drifting away. Over time, people mixed the stories of Ophelia and Siddall together. Both were seen as fragile women, victims of love, even though this was not the true picture of Siddall's life. Her art, her poems, and her bravery were mostly forgotten. As one art historian said, she was framed forever by that bath. Charlotte Corday, Paul Baudry, 1860. You've probably seen the famous painting The Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David from 1793. It shows a quiet, almost peaceful scene. A man slumped in a bathtub, his head gently resting to the side, a letter in his hand. The room is calm, the colors are soft. At first glance it looks like a tragic but noble moment, almost like a martyr's portrait. But that calm is deceptive, because another painting of the same moment reveals what truly happened. In 1860, artist Paul Baudry painted Charlotte Corday, and instead of a quiet scene, he gave us chaos. John Paul's chair is knocked over, papers are scattered on the floor, his body is twisted as he reaches out from the tub, and standing in the corner is a young woman in a striped dress. Her face is calm, almost cold. And once you know who Charlotte Corday was and why she came to Paris, the story becomes even more disturbing. She wasn't someone acting out of rage or madness. She believed she was saving her country. She believed killing one man would stop a wave of bloodshed. Charlotte Corday was born on July 27, 1768, in Normandy, in the north of France. She came from a family that once had some importance, but her father did not have much money. Even so, he tried to give his children a good education. Charlotte grew up reading books by great French writers and by thinkers like Rousseau. Their ideas about freedom, justice, and sacrifice made a deep mark on her. She dreamed of doing something brave and important one day. Charlotte was not a weak or quiet child. She liked to play outside with her brothers and local boys more than staying indoors. But her mother died when Charlotte was still young, and her father could not care for all his children. Because of this, Charlotte was sent to a religious school, an abbey for young girls from poor noble families. There she received a religious education, but the Mother Superior also gave her books on politics and philosophy. Charlotte read eagerly and formed strong opinions. In 1789, the French Revolution began. Many people wanted change because the king, Louis XVI, ruled badly and the country suffered from hunger and unfair laws. Although Charlotte was from a noble family, she supported the ideas of the revolution. She argued often with her father, who had more traditional views. When she could not stand the arguments anymore, she went to live with an elderly relative in the city of Caen. Charlotte again found herself in a place where many people supported the king. This only made her defend her own beliefs more strongly. Then in 1793, a group of politicians arrived in Caen. They belonged to a political group that had fled Paris because of violent riots encouraged by another, more extreme group. Charlotte listened to these politicians every day. They spoke about how the revolution had taken a darker turn. They told her how the other group used fear and violence to control the country. One leader of the opposite group, John Paul, was especially feared. He wrote a newspaper in which he attacked his enemies and called for executions. Hearing these stories, Charlotte became convinced that John Paul was dangerous and cruel. One person in the group even said, "If John Paul dies, France will be saved." Charlotte believed this completely. She decided that killing him would save the country and protect the true spirit of the revolution. On July 9, 1793, Charlotte left Caen for Paris. She believed it was her duty to stop John Paul. When she arrived, she learned that he was very sick with a skin disease. He spent most of his time in a medicinal bath because the water calmed his pain. This meant she could not kill him in public as she had planned, but she decided to go forward anyway. On July 13, 1793, Charlotte bought a kitchen knife. She then went to John Paul's home. At first, she was turned away, but she sent him a note saying she had important news about a plot in Caen. That evening she returned, and this time she was allowed inside. John Paul was in his bathtub, writing notes on a board placed across it. Charlotte sat beside him and gave him some of the names in one group. He told her he would have them all executed. At that moment, Charlotte stood up, took out the knife, and stabbed him once in the chest. The wound killed him almost at once. People rushed into the room and seized her. She did not fight back. She said proudly that she had acted alone. Many people were shocked that a quiet, polite young woman had done such a thing. They believed she must have been controlled by men, but Charlotte insisted it had been her own decision. Charlotte was held in prison while the government tried to make her admit to a larger plot. She refused. She calmly repeated that she had killed John Paul because she believed he was harming France. Her trial lasted only a few hours. There was no real defense possible since she openly admitted everything. She told the court, "I killed one man to save 1,000. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On July 17, 1793, Charlotte was taken to the guillotine. It was raining, but she walked with dignity. Her long hair had been cut short, and she wore a simple red shirt. Right before the blade fell, she asked to see the guillotine, saying she had never seen one before. Moments later, she was executed at age 24. Charlotte believed her act would save the country, but it had the opposite effect. John Paul's death made the Jacobins even more violent, and soon France entered the Reign of Terror, during which thousands of people were killed. Even so, many people admired Charlotte's courage. Others saw her as a murderer, but she had acted according to her beliefs, hoping to protect the ideals she held dear. Her story remains one of the most striking and tragic episodes of the French Revolution. Portrait of Fanny Imlay, 1800s. Many people know Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, a story filled with loneliness, pain, and the feeling of being unwanted. What many don't know is that some of these feelings may have come from a real person in Mary's life, her half-sister, Fanny Imlay. Fanny's life was quiet, sad, and almost forgotten, but when we look closely, we can see how her story echoes inside Frankenstein. Fanny Imlay's life is one of the quietest and saddest stories in the circle around Mary Shelley. When we read about people like Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, Percy Shelley, Byron, and Claire Clairmont, they feel loud, bright, and full of life. But Fanny is different. She appears in their stories like a shadow. She lived with them, but she never seemed to shine the way they did. And then at 19, she traveled alone to a small inn in Wales. She checked in under a false name and took an overdose of laudanum, leaving behind almost no trace except pain and questions. Fanny was born in 1794. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the most important thinkers of her time. Her father, Gilbert Imlay, was an American businessman who loved freedom but did not want responsibility. Mary hoped he would stay with her and their baby, but soon learned he would not. When Fanny was still a baby, Mary even traveled through dangerous parts of Scandinavia on his behalf, trying to win back his love. Fanny spent weeks with a nursemaid in a lonely hotel while her mother worked. In the end, Imlay still abandoned them. Mary was heartbroken and tried to end her life twice. Fanny was far too young to understand, but these early years were filled with fear and uncertainty. Then things changed. Mary fell in love with the writer William Godwin. Fanny adored him and called him Papa. When Mary became pregnant, the couple married. Fanny finally had a home that felt steady. She lived with her mother and Godwin in a quiet area with gardens and open fields. She was 3 years old, a happy age when children feel safe and warm in their little worlds. But in August 1797, everything broke apart again. Mary went into labor with Fanny's new sibling, and although the birth at first seemed normal, something went horribly wrong afterward. The placenta did not come out, and a doctor tried to remove it by hand. Infection set in, and Mary died 11 days later. Fanny, only 3, suddenly had a crying newborn sister and no mother. People rushed through the house, doors slammed, and Fanny was left wondering why Mama was gone forever. For a while, friends helped care for the girls. Fanny struggled to bond with any of them, but slowly Godwin built a new routine. He wrote sweet letters to his daughters when away, read them stories, and tried to teach them, though not very consistently. Fanny's younger sister Mary grew into a bright, lively child. Fanny was quieter and less confident. Still, the household was calm compared to what came next. When Fanny was 8, Godwin married again. The new wife, who called herself Mrs. Clairmont, brought 2 children of her own, including Jane, who later renamed herself Claire. The home became crowded, noisy, and tense. Mrs. Godwin favored her own children. Fanny became the oldest, but not the most loved. She was described as gentle, modest, and eager to please, as if trying to avoid more heartbreak. Money was always a problem. The family opened a bookshop, which did well for a short time but then failed. They moved to a dark house in an unhealthy part of London. Fanny, now older, likely helped with the shop and housework, while Mary and Claire drew attention with their charm and intelligence. Fanny had survived smallpox, which left marks on her face, and Godwin praised Mary far more than her. Even so, Fanny found interest in visiting new schools and learning ideas about teaching. Then Percy Shelley entered their lives. He was young, handsome, and full of dramatic ideals. Fanny may have fallen quietly in love with him, but when he met Mary, the bond between those two was instant and deep. Soon Mary and Shelley ran away together, and Claire went with them. Fanny was left behind. Mrs. Godwin told her that Mary and Claire laughed at her and did not want her. Fanny had no freedom, no job, and no escape. Her stepbrother Charles left to work abroad, but she had few choices. There was talk of her teaching at a school run by her aunts in Ireland, but even that small hope disappeared. While Fanny felt trapped, her sisters were living wild, exciting lives, traveling, writing, falling in love, and staying by beautiful Lake Geneva with Byron. Fanny could only imagine it from her dark home in London. Then in October 1816, Fanny left a note telling her family not to look for her. She traveled first to Bath, where Mary and Shelley were staying, and may have met with them. If she asked to join them and was turned away, it must have crushed her. She then went on to Swansea. There she checked into an inn, drank tea, and went to her room. In the morning she was found dead beside a bottle of laudanum. Her farewell letter said her life had been only pain. Her stepfather let her be buried in a poor grave. Her death shocked the family, but they did not mourn her for long. Even her suicide was soon overshadowed by Harriet Shelley's. Yet Fanny's loneliness left a mark. Many believe her sad end helped shape the voice of the creature in Frankenstein, who cries out, "I am alone and miserable." Fanny's life never truly had a chance to begin, but her quiet grief still echoes in one of the most famous stories ever written.